Right, good morning and welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you here with us today for our talk entitled When Dancing Led to Beheading. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping notes. Please remain muted during the talk so that everyone can enjoy the presentation without distractions. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to jot down any questions you have, and Florence will address them when the talk wraps up. Just a reminder, we are streaming this talk live on our Facebook page, so you can revisit it later and share with others who may be interested. Our speaker today is Dr. Florence Gillman. She's a Timken docent and a professor emerita of Biblical Studies at University of San Diego. So without any further delay, I'll turn the virtual floor over to Florence. Thank you, Florence, and enjoy the talk.
Okay, thank you, Kat. I hope everyone can hear me. Remember, you have a chat function, so if there's any problem with the audio, please send Kat a message. Well, good morning on a rainy morning in San Diego, wherever you are. We're here in the rain, and gee, what a nice atmosphere to have a conversation about some fascinating art and some fascinating history. If you followed these Timken lectures for a few years, you may notice that I lectured on this before and may wonder, why are you repeating? And actually, the impetus to talk about Salome and this gorgeous painting at the Timken is the opera in San Diego. In March, the San Diego Opera is doing the famous opera Salome. So there may be people out there who are preparing for that opera. And I thought it would be a good time to revisit Salome, and this time to also put some more emphasis on the background about the opera, as well as, of course, the history. So this beautiful painting by Ella Ferris Pell was donated to the Timken by Mr. and Mrs. Bram Dykstra. And she's a friend of mine, actually, Salome is. And I was thrilled that we actually have this wonderful painting, and it gives me the occasion to talk about some research, some history, and the opera, and many other paintings. So I need to get this moving here. Yeah. Salome was a real person. And the information concerning her story can be found in the Bible, in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There is an ancient historian named Josephus, who you may know about, who wrote some 20 volumes. Now they're kind of small. They're about this wide and this high in the print form, but he wrote 20 volumes of ancient history which exist. And he also tells the story, parts of the story. There is a lot of art about Salome. There is very interesting literature, both in the form of plays and then the operatic literature and the operatic performances. So Salome has functioned as kind of an ambiguous character. She is the type of a character interpreters, unravelers, and, as I say, psychoanalysts can read a lot into. So she has become a very popular subject from many different angles. Many people know the famous quote from the King James Version of the Bible, which in older English says that John the Baptist's head, which Salome was responsible for John being beheaded, his head was brought in a charger and given to the damsel. Now, contemporary English would assume a charger is a horse, I think, but actually it's the term for a huge platter. And you see that in the picture. She's holding the platter. So John the Baptist's head was on a charger brought to Salome's mother. And in this quote in the King James, she's referred to as a damsel, meaning a young, but not totally young. So a teenage young girl. So maybe you have heard that expression, brought in a charger. All right, let's look at the picture now, and let's ask some questions as we get started. So one thing that fascinates me about pictures that are related to known stories, and in my case, known biblical stories, is to figure out exactly what moment in the story did the artist want to portray. Because a picture cannot portray a whole story normally. And so the artist has to pick a moment. How does the artist know what moment to pick? And can we ourselves figure out from the painting what that moment was? So look at this. We'll come back to it many times, but look carefully and see in your mind, what moment is this? Okay, now this gift from the Dijkstra's of the painting of Salome also raises the question, because of the time frame in which it was painted, of why she has been treated as a femme fatale. So a femme fatale is a dangerous woman, dangerous to men. And she has been portrayed that way in both Jewish and Christian literature. And along with other women, particularly biblical women, who were dangerous to men, such as her mother, Herodias, such as Judith and Jael, just to name a few. So femme fatales are a category of women who are considered dangerous to men. So their success, the success of these women that I just mentioned, who either fatally wounded or had a man beheaded, these women have fascinated artists, and we have quite a history of painting of femme fatales. And it can become confusing because you see some of the art, you're not sure, is that Salome or is that Jael, and so on. So one has to look at the attributes, of course, to sort out those paintings. We're not going to do that here. That's the subject of another whole lecture. But let's look at the artist herself. Ella Ferris Pell was an American painter. You see the dates of her life here. And this is actually a self-portrait of her, painted in her later years when she lived in Beacon, New York. A few brief notes about her life. She was actually born in St. Louis, and she studied in New York at Cooper Union, where she graduated in 1870. And shortly after graduating, she went to London and displayed the painting of Salome, among others, I believe. And this contributed to her success. By the 1890s, she was living in New York City, but she went upstate and summered in the Catskill Mountains, as many New Yorkers do. She died upstate from New York City, just around Newburgh, New York. She died in Beacon, New York in 1922. She was buried in the rural cemetery in Fishkill near her sister, and her grave was not even marked. She was the niece of a man named William Ferris Pell, who unusually was able to buy an important site of American history namely Fort Ticonderoga. So Fort Ticonderoga near Lake Champlain was very important in the in the War of 1812 and so on. And he was able to buy this fort. So he, really appreciating her paintings, collected many of her paintings, and they are now at the Museum of Fort Ticonderoga. But luckily, we have one of them at the Timken. The curator of the Timken, Dr. Derek Cartwright, he had this to say, among many other things, about Pell. He said, her career is illustrative of the challenges faced by many accomplished female artists during the late 19th century. In fact, she is the first American female painter who is represented in the Timken's collection. And hopefully, of course, there will be many more female artists eventually represented. Dr. Cartwright went on to say, Salome was exhibited at the Paris Salon and the National Academy of Design in New York City. It received considerable attention before being acquired as a significant contemporary work by the Boston Art Club. Since then, it has become a mainstay in academic writing about the taste for exotic subject matter in the Gilded Age. Basically, you will see during this talk that interest in Salome has vacillated more recently with the Gilded Age, but going back especially to the Renaissance. So I said that the upcoming opera here occasioned my interest in giving this lecture. And here's the promotional material for the opera. So you can see that based on the information that they give, the opera was adapted from the play written by Oscar Wilde, and the music is by Richard Strauss. So it was first performed in 1905. I'll say more about that in the next few remarks. But what I want to draw your attention to especially is the beautiful poster produced for the opera this year. I will be talking about the story, and I will be talking about the dance of Salome. And what I want to point out here is that for operas performing this work, the dance is the culmination of the story. The dance comes right near the end of the opera. It's called the Dance of the Seven Veils. I was looking to see if this artist was represented the idea of seven veils, and I don't see seven. Maybe you do. But anyway, what the artist is referring to here is the culmination of the opera, the Dance of the Seven Veils. I don't want to change, or I don't want to divulge how the opera actually ends in case you've never seen it. But the dance, Salome's dance near the end, is something everybody waits for. So as the opera material here also tells you, it's adapted from Oscar Wilde's play of the same name. And it's basically the biblical story of Salome being guided by her mother to have John the Baptist killed. We'll look more closely at that in just a minute. Notice at the bottom, it is sung in German, but the opera does project the translations in both English and Spanish. And as you can see, it's coming up in March. To my memory, the opera of Salome has been done in San Diego. At least this is at least the third time in the last 20 or 25 years, which reflects how very popular it is to repeat an opera that often. For the first two productions of it, I worked on the community education aspect of it. And lots of people came to prepare for that opera. There's something both intriguing, extremely colorful, sensuous, controversial about this opera. So I certainly recommend seeing it if you have the chance. You'll notice at the bottom, it's March 21 to 23 at the Civic Theater. Okay, now let's look at a comparison with the San Diego Opera's current poster and Pell's portrayal of Salome. And keep in mind that the question I'm interested in exploring especially is, what moment in the story are we looking at? Well, the opera poster is obvious. It's the dance. But what about Pell? What moment is it? It cannot be before the dance because she's already holding the charger, the platter, which was a result of what happened after the dance. She also looks rather disheveled. But also I would like to call your attention to her face and try to probe from your perspective. What is she thinking about? What moment in this experience for her, which may have been actually terrible, what moment is this? What's going through her mind at this point? Keep that in mind and we'll come back to it. So, yeah, this opera created literally Salomania during the late 1800s. But as I also said, the Renaissance was also very interested in this. Many portrayals will show her as a beautiful, girlish young woman, especially during the Renaissance portrayals. She's beautiful, girlish young woman, actually quite serene in some of the pictures. And the main focus can be on the decapitated head of John the Baptist. But by the late 1800s, Salome was portrayed quite differently in the art as a femme fatale. As we said, a woman dangerous to men and society. Really, using the term Salomania, which I did not invent. Sorry, we can see in the late 19th century that artists and writers had this lascivious Salome on the brain to some extent. So Oscar Wilde wrote the play. It's a one-act tragedy. He wrote it in French in 1891. Notice that's only a year after the Timken Salome was painted. And his play was published in 1893. Now, Oscar Wilde, who is a fascinating character, he could not be present when the play was first produced because he was in prison. He was in prison because he had an affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, who had actually been a translator of the French text of Salome into English. Well, Oscar Wilde was not even present at the first version of production of the play. It's kind of interesting that Oscar Wilde, while he was in France, also visited the artist Armand Blanc. And shortly after that, we have Blanc's version of the Dance of the Seven Veils. So here again, that moment in the story that has attracted some artists and so on is the dance. And in the background, you see Herod Antipas and his wife Herodias. I have not been able to find where this painting is right now. So that's why I don't give you the location on this slide. But again, you see the interest of both of the artists and the artist of the opera's promotional literature in the dance. Now, Oscar Wilde deviated from the biblical story, which I didn't get to yet, but we're getting there. He deviated wildly, and he was criticized for that. He changed the story. Of course, he changed it to the advantage of any kind of production because it became all the more sensuous and all the more mysterious and so on. He said he had no desire to tell the truth of a college professor. He said, I prefer the other truth, my own, which is that of the dream. Between the two truths, the falser is the truer. Whether or not one agrees with him, guess what? This lecture is the truth of a college professor. So what I'm going to tell you is what we can assemble historically. A psychoanalyst could probably tell you in more detail the truth Oscar Wilde says is there. Okay, here goes. So with the truth of a college professor, college professors are always looking for what are the sources? Where's the data? Let's put it together that way. So in search of the real Salome, by the way, you can pronounce her name Salome, French, or Salome. I think I'm more influenced by the Greek of the biblical text, and so I tend to say Salome. Anyway, in search of the real Salome, we will look at historical written sources. So the New Testament and the writings of the historian Josephus. But we will also bring in archaeology, artifacts, and assemble this material to analyze her historically. Now, I've worked on this quite a bit in the past. This is a book I wrote entitled Herodias at Home in That Fox's Den. That's her mother. Herodias is her mother. And her mother was married. Her second marriage was to Herod Antipas, whom Jesus called that fox. So Jesus did not appreciate Herod Antipas's actions and dubbed him that fox, which is why I refer to Herodias living with him as living in the fox's den. So in studying her and her marriage and Herod Antipas, of course, a big piece of it is also studying Salome. By the way, this book is still available, and it's available in libraries, and I have some copies left. It came out in 2003, so it's pretty much out of print, except for libraries and Emmy. Anyway, the historical sources then are the four evangelists and Josephus. And the four evangelists represent very different perspectives, as does Josephus. There you see the dates for Josephus. He lived 38 to 100 AD. The Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke are all written before Josephus writes. Well, not exactly. Actually, Mark is written before, and Matthew and Luke are concurrent with some of the work of Josephus. Okay, now, this looks like a complicated page, but it isn't as complicated as you might think. When you have stories in multiple Gospels, the best way to compare them is to lay them out in a chart. And then you can see what the differences are. Now, in modern biblical studies, and this would be across the board generally, of denominations and whether you're talking about European scholarship or American scholarship or British, whatever. The general consensus is that the Gospel of Mark was written first, and that Matthew copied Mark and changed Mark with additions and some omissions. And Luke likewise did the same independently. Luke copied Mark and added a great deal and left out. So when you map it out like this on a page and you look at the right column, for example, you can see that Luke actually took only a little bit of information about this story from Mark and then left it out. There was something about this story that either did not fit his agenda or something about it he did not like. Actually, a very educated guess is based on his treatment of women in general, is that he might be too strong, but you could say he feared or had an aversion to or did not want to promote women taking action on their own. Powerful women, not poor women, powerful women. In any case, he left the story out. All right, now look on the left, and you can see compared to the text of Mark, you can see that Matthew took a lot of it, but he left out some things. And if we look closely at it, very closely at it, we can also see that Matthew changed some things within the story. Now I'm going to go through rather fast. I'm guessing lots of you know this story, but I'm just going to point out a couple of the major differences that occur on Matthew's side. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. So Mark starts out, Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Put in more contemporary language, basically it says that Herod had arrested John and put him in prison, actually in protective arrest, because of Herodias, whom he had married. And John had criticized their marriage. He had said, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Well, both Herod and Herodias had already been married and divorced. Was John the Baptist's critique that Herod and Herodias should not be married because both had been divorced? No. The Jewish prohibition that John the Baptist is defending is that if you married your brother, your husband's brother, that was considered incest. We don't think that way. But in the thinking of the time, the Jewish thinking of the time, when you married into a family, you literally became a member of the family. And so if you married your divorced husband's brother, that was incest. This is complicated, but this was the issue. Now, Herodias did not like that. So moving on, you see in verse 19, Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. She wanted to kill him. Okay, now Matthew changed this. Go over to Matthew and look what Matthew says. Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother's wife, because John had been telling him, it is not lawful for you to have her. Though Herod wanted to put him to death. Notice that, it's not Herodias. Matthew changes it. Herod wanted to put him to death. He feared the crowd because they regarded him as a prophet. So Matthew actually changed the reason for the imprisonment, where it's a protective imprisonment in Mark, and it's Herodias who wants to kill him. In Matthew, Herod has arrested him, but he's afraid to kill him. He wants to kill him, but he's afraid. Okay, so back to Mark. Mark says Herodias could not kill him because she knew Herod feared John. And she knew that her husband Antipas, Herod Antipas, protected him. Looking at verse 20 under Mark, when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. I think the key word there is opportunity. She had a chance at Herod's birthday to get John killed. Now, how did that work out? Well, go down further now to verse 22 under Mark. And it says, when his daughter Herodias came in, actually, it's a mistake. Mark has the name wrong. It's actually, he should have written when the daughter of Herodias, or he should have written Salome. When his daughter came in, would be his stepdaughter actually, and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish and I will give it. Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom. Well, he couldn't give away half of his kingdom. He only ruled because he ruled at the under the Romans. The Romans were his bosses, and he was a puppet king. So this is a very exaggerated kind of a promise. Some people say it reflects that the dance she did so affected Herod that he uses this extreme example that he'll give her even half of his kingdom. This is part of the argument that supports the idea that the dance was very erotic. It wasn't the dance of a little girl, isn't that cute? It was a dance that really got to Herod, and so erotic that he offers his kingdom. So Salome goes out and asks her mother, what should I ask for? And here's where you have that famous line from the King James Version, the head of John the Baptist on a charger. So she wants the head of John the Baptizer, who just happens to be in prison right there at the site of the banquet, which I will show you in a few minutes. I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Okay, the king was grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Imagine, he gives the man's head rather than being embarrassed in front of his friends. Yeah, so you know the rest of the story. So John is beheaded, and indeed, John's head is placed on a platter and given to the girl, and who gives it to Herod Antipas. Whatever happened to John's head? The story doesn't tell us. There are so many places that claim they have his head. Most of them churches all over Europe and England. They claim they have the head of the Baptist. Of course, we have no idea. The story doesn't finish telling us that. Okay, so you had the general story. Now, what does Josephus tell us about this incident? Well, in his he is commenting on this from the perspective of an interest in Herod Antipas as a ruler. So here's a section, I put some of it in red, because he takes a quite different approach to what happened. Herod Antipas's army had been defeated, and Josephus says it seemed to be divine vengeance. For Herod Antipas had put John to death, though he was a good man, and he exhorted the Jews to lead righteous lives, to practice justice towards their fellows and piety towards God, and so on. Josephus opines eloquence that had so great an effect on mankind might lead to some form of sedition, or it looked as if they would be guided by John in everything they did. So in other words, John had power over crowds, and that is Josephus's read that Herod Antipas is afraid of the crowds. So Josephus says, Herod decided that it would be much better to strike first and be rid of him before his work led to an uprising than to wait for an upheaval, and so on. Now notice what Josephus tells us a few lines down. Though John, because of Herod's suspicions, was brought and chained to Machaerus and there put to death, yet the verdict of the Jews was that the destruction visited upon Herod's army was a vindication of John. So what we find here is Josephus tells us where the beheading and therefore also the birthday party took place. And that is the Machaerus, which is a fortress, which I'll show you. Okay, back to some of the art. Okay, of course, among the greatest portrayals of John are Caravaggio's. This one is the young John the Baptist. And notice, of course, the red, which is the attribute of a martyr. And notice this Caravaggio, which is in Malta. Here we see some aspects of the story of the beheading. So we see it right before John's head is decapitated, I think, although it looks like blood there, doesn't it? But I think, well, the sword is laying down too. Not sure the exact moment here. But what moment we also see is, here's a servant girl with the charger, with the platter. The platters are depicted differently in the art. Some have a bowl shape to them and others are flat. One even has a cover. Is this Salome herself? I do not think so, because she's got all these clothes on. I don't think this is the dancer. This is the servant who is sent to get his head. So the moment Caravaggio chooses is probably right before the decapitation. We see the knife in the guard's hand, and we see the charger ready to accept the head. Now, I said in the Renaissance portrays Salome differently than the Gilded Age does. Here you can see Titian's view of the moment she receives the charger with the head of the Baptist. And I would ask you to notice that she leans to the right. It's kind of a characteristic of the Renaissance pictures, as if she's leaning away, as if this is detestable, or this smells awful, or as if she doesn't want to be holding this decapitated head. And she's portrayed as a very beautiful young person. She's not portrayed as disheveled at all, as we saw in the Edna Ferris-Pell painting. Similar, this Luini painting, Renaissance. Here she is again receiving the head of the Baptist, looking away, not looking disheveled. What is she thinking at this moment? What did the Renaissance what was the moment the Renaissance painters especially focused on in these paintings where we see her just receiving the head and turned away, turned to the right? This one's really interesting. This one's Peter Paul Rubens in Birmingham, a little later than the previous two we looked at. And you see a raucous party going on, the setting of Herod's birthday party, even with a child and a dog in the painting. And we see Salome here bringing demurely, in a sense, bringing the head to Herodias and Antipas. I'm going to do a detail of this one. So I'm zeroing in on this painting. Look at the faces. You don't see so much of Herod, but I think you see enough to wonder. I would say he might be thinking, what have I done? But one cannot be sure what the artist intended. Certainly, Herodias looks pleased. What about Salome? Well, again, we don't have a disheveled sense. She does not look upset in any way. She is the one placed in red as the killer of the martyr. Okay. Before I talk now more about the historical situation, I would like to take a couple questions. Just very short questions, please, if you have any. Okay, it's fine. We can, if you have any questions, keep them in mind and we'll come back to them at the end. So the location of where this story happens is, of course, right here in Judea. So the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, the area called the Levant, in which Judea is a province of the Roman Empire. So the whole New Testament period is contained within the period of Roman domination. So looking at zeroing in now on the map of Judea in the 1st century, okay, we can see that Judea is divided into general regions. The ones that really relate to this story are Galilee and over here, Perea. So Herod Antipas was a puppet king. His father, Herod the Great, had ruled all of this land. But the Romans were not too happy with the Herodian family. So after Herod the Great died in 4 BC, just after the birth of Jesus, the Romans divided up the leadership of the province. So Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas, that we're talking about, he ruled 2 non-contiguous territories, Galilee and Perea, down here. So the action takes place down here. The action of the story actually takes place down here, way down in Machaerus. Even though the capital city, you could say, for lack of another term, the main cities for Herod Antipas were Sepphoris and Tiberias up here. Why were they way down here along the eastern shores of the Dead Sea? Because there were fortresses that Herod in particular had built all the way through the territory. And these fortresses were so wonderful. They were supplied with plenty of provisions for many troops and so on. They were placed on very high locations, beautiful wind-swept, gorgeous mountaintops. And they also served then as the places where the descendants of Herod the Great, such as Herod Antipas and Herodias and Salome, where they went for literally vacations. So they were often in these fortresses. To try to get this family straight is not easy. Even writing a book about them, I had to have charts put up on the wall over my desk, trying to keep them straight because they followed a practice that we would never do, and that is they married within the family. So they practice what is called endogamy, and therefore uncle-niece marriages were quite common. And multiple marriages, of course, happened, and so they are really hard to get a hold of. So this chart is a simplified chart, believe it or not, from the book I wrote, and to help people who are reading the stories about the material about Herodias and Salome follow the story. So, gosh, here's Herodias. Okay, let's start with her. She is a granddaughter. Okay. Wait a minute. Here she is. She is married first to this Herod, who is a son of one of the 10 wives. That complicates it too. One of the 10 wives of Herod the Great. This is the man she divorced, by whom she had given birth to Salome. Then she marries Antipas here. Okay. And you see that he's really up here. He's really the son of another of the wives of Herod the Great. That's enough right there to make your head spin. But that's the marital situation. So what can I tell you about the rest of the story as we can put it together? Well, this map's pretty good, showing you some of the fortresses, some of the getaway places. It's only showing you a few. See the little fortress sign? There were some of them spread around up in here too, and many of them exist, like Masada. If you have been in Israel in, I'd say, any time since the middle of the 20th century, you probably went to Masada. Masada was excavated by the famous Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin, and so it is one of the most important places that tourists go to in Israel. So this fortress we're interested in is very comparable, but on the other side of the Dead Sea, and it would today be Jordanian territory. But as you can see, in the 1st century AD, it is part of the territory of Herod Antipas, Galilee and Perea. So that's what we're going to zero in on here now. This is the capital, the capital city, the main city that Herod Antipas had back here in Galilee. That has been well excavated in the late 20th century. And as you can see, the bulks that are used to carry out the excavation here. So the fortress now is here. So this picture is taken from the Jordanian side. You're looking across the Dead Sea. You're looking at the cliffs on the Israeli side. Way up here on the way to the right are the cliffs where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found and so on. Okay, up here you can see the excavations of the palace. Amazingly, there is still a great deal there. So you can take this road here around and eventually get up there from the other side. Here's another picture showing that same road and seeing up here. Now, the reason these places were so high was, of course, it was easier to defend a place from the heights. It was easier to throw stones down on people's head, throw fire down on their head. from up high than from lower down. And of course, they could see any people coming to bother them. Okay, these could withstand siege. The high locations were safe and beautiful. You could not take a full army up there altogether, so you could pick them off a few at a time. And as I said, these are great vacation spots for the Herodians. So what we see actually is the part of the palace structure. And one of the archaeological reports points out that the dining room was actually separated into two parts, which fits the description of a lot of things where the women were dining in one place and the men in another, and fits the idea in the biblical story, interestingly, that Salome went out to ask her mother what to ask for. So this is the amount of history we can put together about the place where John was killed. And here's a close-up view of Herod's palace. Okay, and a much closer view and on different condition of light here. Okay, what happened to Salome after the banquet and after the beheading? Well, Salome must have been very young because she eventually was married to an old uncle, and even after that, had a second marriage. So now I'll try to tell you just a little bit more of historical data about Salome herself. So she was married to a very old uncle, Philip, and he was her father's half-brother and her mother's great uncle. She did not have any children by him. He was the tetrarch of some northern territories that I'll show you. Yeah, as I said, the marriage was childless. His capital city was called Caesarea Philippi. He died in 34 CE. By the way, what would be the date of John the Baptist's beheading? Probably around 27. So about 27, John was beheaded. Jesus then begins his more public ministry in the transition from John. Jesus would die in either 30 or 33. Both of those dates fit the information that we do have. So Salome, during all that, Salome is married to Philip, living in Caesarea Philippi and childless. So she's living right up here. You see Caesarea Philippi. She spends most of the rest of her life up here in the north. When Philip died, and here he is, there is a coin minted showing him, Philip, but not her, unfortunately. After he died, she then was married to a prince in Chalcis. See Chalcis up here, way in the north? Okay, so she then becomes the queen of Chalcis. Her husband's name is Aristobulus. And this today would be very close to, it would be south of Aleppo, Syria. Aristobulus was her first cousin, and they had 3 sons. So 34, sometime after 34, she has 3 sons. This is the place that today is called Kenazrin, south of Aleppo, and the ancient area is a tell. There is an acropolis, but there's no evidence yet of Salome. I hope some will be found, but we do have this coin, which Aristobulus had minted, calling himself the King of Armenia Minor, and it was minted sometime between 54 and 92. Maybe the estimation is maybe around 66. which means she would have been alive still then. And here you see then how she is represented. There is another coin also of her as Queen of Chalcis. So this is the main archaeological evidence we actually have of her herself, besides the fortress of Machaerus. Well, we can end on this note. And there we see the artist's view, Edna Ferris-Pell's view, and the coin maker's view of her at a much older age. Looking at the picture one more time and going back to my question of what moment is it? What is she thinking? It's clear she's been given the platter. It's clear she knows what she's supposed to go do. Go get his head and bring it in on the platter. I think if you look at her face, I think she's very pensive. I'm not sure she is happy her mother gave her this murderous task. Does she feel caught in this situation? What's going on in her head? What did Edna Pell want us to think about looking at her? Well, I'm not sure we can ever be sure. Okay, I'm happy now. I know I have one question here from Ryan asking why she would ask for it on a platter. Is that a translation issue, he says, or was it meant to be the most outlandish request? There is a tradition in some ancient stories, not so much in the Bible, but other places, but of women having men killed at dinner parties. And it's sort of some of the femme fatales of ancient literature. And so to serve a man's head, of course, you need a platter. So it picks up, I think, on that ancient idea of not only will we kill him, but we'll eat him. And I'm sure we could discuss that all day. Okay, another question is, many artists depict Salome as having red hair, auburn hair. Is there any bias? I'm not aware of any art historians who comment on that. Certainly, it helps with the coloration of the picture. So, the red hair adds a sense of flaming beauty to her that would not be there, let's say, if she were brown haired, maybe. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay. Hi, Jane.
Hi. About the red hair, I remember when we had the Dykstra paintings at the Timken, there was talk about women with red hair being femme fatales. I mean, this was an indication of a loose woman. So that's one thing. And the other, I think this painting shows more than one point in time. I think it's before, where she's looking, as you said, pensive or slightly apprehensive. But with her, I just realized with her, the way her arm goes across her body to hold put the hand on her other arm, is in a way kind of keeping herself back from doing something that her mother has asked her to do. We know she did it, but this would show some kind of resistance, that just as an indicator of her feelings. And then showing the platter is like 2 points in time: before, by looking at her face and that arm, and then the platter, which would come up after, which would then hold his head.
Well, I think your observations are really to the point, and you have done exactly probably what Edna wanted us to do, which is to probe this moment. What exact moment is this?
Yeah.
I wish Edna had written about it, but on the other hand, that leaves people like you and me to speculate what exactly is going through her mind it has to be before she goes to get the head because the platter is clean.
Right.
It has to be before, but she knows what she's been told to do. And how does she really feel? And
Mm.
is she really a femme fatale, or is she manipulated and her mother is the real femme fatale? But she collaborates. There are actually legends, I did not put them into the talk, but there are actually legends about how Salome died supposedly ice skating on a pond, and she went through the ice and it decapitated her. Things like that. I didn't get into the legends, but people have not let this story go because it's too interesting. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you for your comments. And hey, have a wonderful day. And don't forget to take some time and stop in right in front of this painting in the American Gallery.
Thank you so
you,
much for your
Florence. This
talk.
was
That was
wonderful.
wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone.